Welcome, everyone. Glad that you could make it this afternoon. We have a great uh, event with Dr. Eric Tang about pursuing racial justice amid gentrification right here in Austin. My name is Peniel Joseph, and I am the Barbara Jordan Chair in Political Values and Ethics at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, where I'm also the founding director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. And on the College of Liberal Arts side, I'm a professor of history as well. So doing a lot of things. We've been in this space nationally of anti-racism even before this 2020 year of plague, protest, and pandemic. And we want to talk today with really one of the foremost experts about gentrification in Austin in the country, my friend, my colleague, Dr. Eric Tang. And Dr. Tang has done a whole lot of work. Those of you who might be students on this call know him as this very popular and charismatic professor. He is a professor of African and African Diaspora Studies and director of the Center for Asian American Studies and the major Race, Indigeneity, and Migration. He's the author of the book Unsettled, which is also his Twitter account, Cambodian Refugees in the New York City Hyper Ghetto. And he's working on a new book, which is close to being done, Fire in the Streets, which revisits the urban rebellions of the late 1960s. He's co-authored the report Outlier, the Case of Austin's Declining African-American Population, which revealed that Austin was the only major city in the United States to experience a numerical decline in African-American population. And he's also the author of this great Institute for Urban Policy Research and Analysis and many different reports, but Those Who Stayed, the Impact of Gentrification on Longstanding Residents of East Austin. So without further ado, Dr. Eric Tang, and I think what we're talking about today with gentrification, this is connected to voting, it's connected to the 2020 election, but also beyond, because sometimes we get so focused on an election that we don't think to ourselves, what's going to happen the day after the election? So here at the CSRD, we urge everyone to vote and register to vote and exercise your democratic and constitutional rights, but we're also thinking bigger picture and longer term. So without further ado, Dr. Eric Tang.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Joseph. And thank you, Emily Dunkley, for all your work in putting this together behind the scenes. So today I would like to begin by setting out some objectives. And I think the first objective is to get a sense of what exactly is happening with Austin and gentrification and its particular impact on African Americans. And so what we'll do is we'll go through a couple of data points about African Americans and gentrification. But I want to begin by proposing that the defining feature of gentrification is displacement. It isn't fancy coffee shops. It isn't, rapid demographic turnover, although those are all symptomatic of gentrification. Gentrification's defining feature is actually displacement of longstanding residents. And how and why did that happen to African Americans at such an intense degree here in Austin is really what I want to get at, okay? And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen and share with you my slide deck that will take us through some of these points. Okay, so I actually want to begin by talking about something that happened last week, something unfortunate that happened last week at Evergreen Cemetery. Evergreen Cemetery is a historically Black cemetery, the historically Black cemetery in East Austin. And last week it was vandalized, okay? The police have not, investigators have not determined it to be an official hate crime because it didn't meet the hate crime threshold, but it was a desecration of African-American life and death. What the media fails to report on, though, when they talk about this, is why we have a historic Black cemetery in Austin and the significance of Evergreen. Evergreen was founded in 1926 And that is approximately the same moment or the same time that the city implemented what is known as its master plan to create a segregated so-called Negro district in Austin. And so the rule in Austin was you couldn't live together, but you also couldn't die together. And so they were also going to create a separate cemetery for African Americans. Now, this was welcomed by many African Americans despite segregation, because before the founding of Evergreen Cemetery, many African Americans were buried in the main city cemetery, which is right by our campus on UT. It's today called Oakwood. And that huge city cemetery had a separate area, which was the Negro burial area, right? So again, under the Jim Crow regime of Austin, you couldn't die together. However, that area today is mostly a barren field because many African American families couldn't afford headstones, and so the city put up wooden crosses, and over the decades, over the centuries really, those wooden crosses deteriorated, decomposed, and no one ever went back to actually find out who was where. They didn't plot the graves properly, they didn't keep good records, and they didn't go back and create headstones. And so Evergreen was supposed to be the historical corrective to that, right? And the fact that it was vandalized brings to the surface a range of historical injustices, a range of ways in which the Black community has been not just segregated, but erased, and in this case, defaced. So I want to begin with that as the historical context to some of the things that I'll be presenting on. Okay, so as Dr. Joseph mentioned, we did a study which showed that Austin between the years 2000 and 2010 was the only major growing city in the United States that saw a simultaneous decline in African Americans. A couple of key terms to get through. A major city is any city with over 500,000. A major growing city is any such city that saw 10% growth in its general population within that 10-year period. Okay, so if you were a city of 1 million people in 2000, right, and you grew by at least 100,000 by 2010, you are what we consider a major growing city. So Austin fits both criteria because Austin's rate of growth between 2000 and 2010 was 20.4%, which is incredible. It's made it the third fastest major growing city in the country. Okay, and so the general hypothesis, the general trend is that any city that sees double-digit growth like Austin did will also see growth in all its racial populations at the same time. Now, all those groups might not keep pace with general population growth. So for instance, you know, the African-American community wasn't expected to grow at 20.4%, but we wanted to see at least some positive growth, right? Because of how rapidly Austin was growing. But Austin was exceptional in this case. Every other major growing city in the country saw simultaneous growth in African Americans, save for one, Austin. In fact, no city with less than 8.5% growth experienced any losses in African Americans. And again, Austin's growth was 20.4%. So Austin actually lost African Americans against all this tremendous growth. And to visualize that, I present you with this chart. So here you have about 10 of the top fastest growing cities in the country between 2000 and 2010. And you see the Black population growth is represented by the yellow bar, the general population growth represented by the turquoise. In all cases, you have Black growth and general population growth moving in the same trajectory, except for in one case, Austin, where it's going in the opposite direction. So this just doesn't happen, is what we're saying. That you don't see an absolute decline in African Americans against such tremendous growth. And it's important for me to make it a distinction here because sometimes people think, oh, well, actually, we didn't lose African Americans. We just, you know, saw a smaller share of them against such tremendous growth, right? That, you know, instead of being 15%, they were now 8% of the population, but they were still growing in absolute numbers. That isn't the case. This loss represents an absolute loss. African Americans went from being 64,259 in 2000 to 60,760. Now you might say, well, Dr. Tang, that's not such a huge number. It's just a couple of thousand. But you have to consider that African Americans were leaving the city, or were displaced from the city in such high numbers that against 20.4% growth, there weren't enough African Americans in migration to replace the ones that we lost, right? And so it's really about the fact that we are growing so fast and yet hemorrhaging African Americans over between 2000 and 2010 that we couldn't even avail ourselves of the tremendous growth that this city experienced. And this makes Austin a statistical outlier. Now, other cities in America that are major cities also lost African Americans, right? Absolutely, that isn't news to us. We know that's true of places like New York, where I'm from, in historically Black cities like Baltimore, right? Washington, D.C., LA, so on and so forth. But if you look at this chart, what you'll see is that these cities did not experience anywhere near as much growth as Austin. In fact, cities like Baltimore shrank in the general population, and African Americans went with it, right? Only San Diego, which saw 6.9%, growth in its general population, right, could be close to Austin, and that's 6.9% compared to 20.4%. So I take that back; it's not even close, right? So cities that lost African Americans weren't major growing cities to begin with, and this again is what underscores Austin's outlier status. All right. And if we compare it to cities in Texas that are comparable, San Antonio, El Paso, Fort Worth, which are more comparable to Austin than Houston and Dallas are in terms of size and demographics, all three of those cities saw simultaneous growth in both the general population and African Americans. And you see a really impressive upswing in the number of African Americans in places like Fort Worth. Okay, so how did this all come to pass? In a nutshell, what happened was during the early 2000s, you saw the convergence of Jim Crow racism, historical Jim Crow racism in Austin, and what we might call neoliberal gentrification. So Jim Crowism and neoliberalism converged in the early 2000s. Let's talk about what Jim Crow is in Austin. So prior to 1928, African Americans, those who were formerly enslaved, lived in communities all over Austin, in what we call the different freeman communities throughout the city. So you might be familiar with neighborhoods like Clarksville, Wheatsville, right? These are all former freeman communities. And they were located central and west, not far from campus. In the early 1900s and by the 1920s, the city wanted to create a separate Negro district to pull all these African American residents into one area, all right, to create a separate so-called Negro district. And it couldn't forcibly move people into this area of East Austin, which it designated as a segregated area. But what it did do was it said, schools are legally segregated because this is before Brown versus Board of Ed. So if you want your child to have a public education, they've got to move to the east side. If you want parks that you can go to, then you best move to the east side. On top of that, we won't run water meters in your neighborhoods in Clarksville and Wheatsville, but if you move to the east side, we'll do so. And so they were compelled to relocate, and it worked. By the mid to late 1930s, approximately 80% of the Black population, which once lived all over Austin, was now on this east side. And this is the classic Jim Crow story. On the east side, you had unequal schools, environmental racism, right? All the polluting industries were placed there as well as part of the master plan. Virtually all public housing, when public housing became a thing after World War II, was on the east side. And all the city's concentrations of poverty and unemployment could be mapped on the east side. All right. Actually, let me not get ahead of myself. So the east side becomes synonymous with African Americans and Mexican Americans who are also pushed to the east side, though the city never designed a so-called brown district or Mexican district. The segregation of Mexican Americans was less statutory, less planned than it was for African Americans. Fast forward several decades to the 1990s, and this very same area on the east side becomes coveted land for a professional class. In other words, it becomes the site of gentrification. Why? Because it's so close to downtown. So those who designed the master plan of 1928 likely never anticipated that the area just east of it would become prime real estate for a professional class as Austin grew, right? As the tech industry boomed, as UT continued to grow, as the healthcare industry also took off here in Austin. And so this area, to which 80% of African Americans were concentrated, becomes seen as a place for gentrification. And by the early 2000s, right, you see rapid displacement of African Americans from the east side, all right? And I'm not going to go through these census data points because for the sake of time, but suffice to say that between 2000 and 2010, you see demographic data which shows clearly that African Americans are being displaced, right? You see that poverty is decreasing in areas where African Americans once lived, and that's because African Americans are taking their poverty and moving it out with them to points east and points north, all right, outside the city limits. You also see the property values in African American historic neighborhoods skyrocket between these decades, okay? Homeownership rates also go up, right? Suggesting that people who used to be renting in African American neighborhoods are now being displaced by people who are buying these properties and living in these single family homes. And to give you a kind of visual sense of just how rapid this displacement is, look at these maps. The purple represents 80% plus African American concentrations on the east side in 1990 and in 2000 in these two maps that are side by side. So you can see the purple, right? It's pretty visible. Now look at this change between the next decade. Between 2000 and 2010, the purple is practically indiscernible, all right? So this gives you a sense of just how rapid the displacement of African Americans was between the first decade of the 21st century. And if you want that in raw numbers, we took one census tract block group, right? And this is a census tract block group that my students and I surveyed directly in 2016, I believe. And the Black population decreased by 60%, the Latino population by 33%, while the white population grew by 442% in that area. That just is indicative of one census tract block group, like one set of houses within a neighborhood. And there were 0 Asians according to the census in 2000, so the population growth of Asian Americans in that area is negligible. Okay, so this is essentially why African Americans were so singular in being the only group in Austin to see a simultaneous loss in total numbers against tremendous growth. It's the way that Jim Crow segregation pushed them all into one area to begin with, and then gentrification came to that one area to displace them in very large numbers in a very singular way decades later. Now you might ask, well, why didn't these African American families simply move to other parts of Austin? Why did they move out of Austin entirely, thus making Austin the only major growing city with an absolute loss of African Americans? Well, that's because the rest of the city became simultaneously unaffordable. And areas outside the city limits, those housing prices were drastically lower than the ones within the city limits. And so African Americans decided to move to places like Pflugerville, like Round Rock, where they could get more square footage and more equity on their homes, as opposed to moving to other less affordable areas within the city limits. Now, those who moved north tended to maintain a pretty decent quality of life. We've surveyed them, and there's very little buyer's remorse if you're in Pflugerville or Round Rock. However, as the 2000s wore on, more families who didn't have as much money and as much means to moved to points east, like Manor, Elgin, Bastrop. And there, they actually talk about buyer's remorse. there they realized that more square footage wasn't necessarily a better quality of life. There are a lot of problems with so-called food deserts, which really mean that they don't have access to healthy foods and supermarkets. They have to pay for basic services like waste removal. They have to pay for water. And there's only one way in or one way out because the roads, the infrastructure is not up to par, right? And so this displacement of African Americans, and I'm going to leave it here and we're going to have a discussion, is not a suburbanization move up as we associate with, say, like white families during the mid 20th century. It's a move out. That's all it is. It's a move out. It's displacement. And again, the defining feature of gentrification is displacement. So I think I'm going to leave it there. And I guess we'll open it up for some discussion, Peniel. Is that what we're doing? And then some
Yeah,
questions from the
absolutely.
audience? All right.
Yeah,
Sounds good.
I'm really going to be your interlocutor, and then we're going to open it up. So if we just end the screen sharing. Yeah, no, great. Thank you for that presentation. And like I was telling everybody, I think so many people, this webinar is going to be available on YouTube afterwards, but so many people have been looking for resources, especially this year, about what people are calling anti-racism. I call it racial justice, but really history and the scholarship and the activism and the community organizing, that's what's anti-racist, but people need to know that history. So in terms of gentrification, and I'm thinking about the presidential debates and this idea of the suburbs will be destroyed and what's happening in our country right now. I think you make an excellent case in the sense of saying, look, gentrification is not about a new Starbucks or a new curated kind of restaurant opening up in predominantly Black communities. It's really about displacement and who leaves and who stays and why. I think that's a really profound intervention, and I appreciate that. So when we think about Austin, I think what we all want to know in 2020, what can we do? Because when we think about gentrification per se, more investment, more white bodies into a neighborhood is not negative in and of itself. What we're saying is the displacement, the unequal power relations, where Black and Indigenous people can't participate in these new communities being formed. And unfortunately, a lot of times that's by design, where new people are coming in and saying, look, I want this great school, but I want a school that actually, quite frankly, doesn't have African Americans or a lot of African Americans. I want a neighborhood that doesn't have. Now that we're in a new moment of this racial and political reckoning, what can we do? Because as we all know, Austin has this reputation as keep it weird, liberal city. But when you look at those data points, you see that we're implicated in these systems of oppression and displacement as well. So what can we do to not even just stem this tide, but to really reverse it and invest in these communities? What can the city do? And I know it's not just their city and our elected officials. We have Silicon Hills right now in Austin. We've got billionaires and millionaires and C-suite folks. What can they do as well if we're going to really pursue racial justice, social economic justice, and equity?
So those are huge questions. And short of being prescriptive, what I thought I might do is, put some provocations out there or some things to think about. So how did we get here? We got here not because the market got hot and all of a sudden people wanted the homes of African Americans who lived on the East Side, most of whom were working class or working poor. We got here because the state deliberately created a segregated neighborhood, a segregated area known as the Negro District, that it was purposefully going to underserve and underdevelop as part of Austin's broader growth. It was designed by the state and their partners in the private sector. And you could go ahead and read the 1928 master plan, which was written by a firm in Chicago. Go ahead and read it. It doesn't read like a document in white supremacy, it doesn't have all these statements about the dehumanizing, if you will, African Americans, but it is a statement of white supremacy in that it says clearly we need we have a Negro problem, and and that is that they're everywhere in the city, and we want to segregate them in this one area. The state did that. Okay. So when we look decades later at what needs to be resolved, isn't it only fair to say, what is the state going to do to redress that? You talked about a moment of racial reckoning. Well, what does that actually mean? Does it mean just feeling good about feeling bad? Or does it mean we go ahead and say, hey, we did this. This caused this problem of displacement. What does the state need to do to redress? And one of the key things that it can do is invest in a very robust, affordable housing program. And I'm not talking about, just giving developers a subsidy to create some, studio that goes to low income or 70% MFI, family. And usually it doesn't even go to a family. It'll go to like, some single person.
And can you break down what 70% MFI means?
Sure. It means that if Austin's median family income of a family of 4 is 80,000, someone who makes 70% of 80,000, and I can't do the math in my head right now, but you get the point, then qualifies for housing that is built by a developer who got a subsidy from the city to only sell it to people who make within that income bracket. Okay. And that pretty much is all we have in terms of the city's affordable housing. We don't have a more robust program than that. And we certainly don't have one that says, hey, look, we got to calculate exactly what our actions in the name of racial injustice have done to people and take steps commensurate to redress that. And steps commensurate to redress that would be hundreds of millions of dollars in affordable housing that perhaps prioritizes African-American families who have been displaced and also who were pushed into these areas forcibly, right?
And when we think about that as a policy prescription, both statewide, but let's look at just the city of Austin, Travis County. How would that look? Because I live in Hyde Park. This is a predominantly white area. It was built as an all-white neighborhood, and I've seen the advertising and Hyde Park, just it's all white and just come in there.
Did you have to hire an attorney to get the restricted covenant taken off of?
My home didn't have a restrictive covenant because it was built after. So this one was originally built like 1950 or a little after. So I didn't have that to do that. But what I want to know and want you to tell us is how does housing affordability look in Austin in the context of we've had disputes over zoning and residential codes and density right here off of Duval, off of 45th Street. We've got the Grove. The Grove is going to add major density, but it's going to add major wealth. So people are fine with density when it's connected to really whiteness and wealth, but anti-Blackness makes us think of density and not high-rise projects like the old show Good Times, but just apartments, townhouses. If it's going to be Black people and brown people, neighbors, including liberal neighbors, really oppose that. And I've seen that right here in Hyde Park. So what does a just affordable housing plan look like? What does it look like? And would it just be like the 70% median family income, or even people who are poorer? Where would they be distributed? And again, let's talk granularly. Where would those new Black families and their children go to school? Because this is what people are, really concerned about. Yeah.
No, I hear you. And I think maybe we should begin there. I think we build the affordable housing for deep affordability, not 70% MFI, but if you look at who's really being displaced, it's people who fall well below that. Although there's an interesting paradox, because if you make way too little money, then you can't go anywhere, right? And so like the extremely poor are actually still in Austin, in these smaller apartment complexes that you'll find like around by Cameron Road, by St. John. And that's because they don't even have the means to move east. Right? But it's the people who are kind of like 50%, MFI right around there who might be able to scrape it together to get out, right? So we do need to look at what we're going to do long term for people who are so poor that they can't move, right? And these are the people that are increasing the homeless population in Austin. And then those who are on the cusp, right, and might just have enough to move, but then move points east where they're isolated. I think that's where we need to target. And you asked me, what does an affordable housing program look like? Well, it looks like, again, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars into a fund in which you build units that are affordable in perpetuity. The city could own the land, or it could be held in community land trusts that ensure that people who make a certain amount don't have a problem finding adequate housing within the city limits. Okay.
Who would build that housing, Eric? Because I'm from New York City, just like you, and I've been connected to nonprofits years ago in Brooklyn and different places that actually got money from the city to renovate brownstones in Brooklyn and give it to probably like you said, MFI 70%, but lower income folks who in a lottery suddenly could get this brownstone and had multiple apartments, could rent it out. But in that case, they let the nonprofit actually connect with contractors to rehab. So the nonprofit basically got a grant. And then it was a nonprofit that sort of dealt with city approved contractors. So who would be doing the building? How would this look?
Yeah, without again getting too prescriptive, right? I won't say categorically that having nonprofits mediate this and having developers who are actually specializing in affordable housing and whose business model is to build affordable housing for cities is the right or wrong way to go. Perhaps the best thing to say is that we need a diverse strategy, right? But what I will say though is that funding it, right, the revenue for it is paramount. Mm-hmm. Where is this going to come from? And there were a couple of ideas that Austin organizers and advocates tried to implement a few years ago. One of them was to attach a fee to all new development, right? That fee would then go into a fund for affordable housing. The state of Austin, the state legislature killed that idea, right? Even though developers in Austin, I think it's fair to say, would have been happy to pay it. It's a price of doing business. And some of them probably would have wanted to pay that before they, built affordable housing within whatever they were developing. They'd say, take the money instead. Mm-hmm. So the linkage fee was killed. There's also tons of land that the city owns. Mm-hmm. And, it's still a wonder to me that they sold the land so cheaply, if they indeed sold it, or not gave it away to developers in exchange for, different public, benefits, right? Including building some affordable housing within these neighborhoods such as Mueller, right? Yeah. Now, I wonder if they should have just sold this land at market to the developers, taken that money, and then built affordable housing with that money. So there are different missed opportunities, in my view, for how we could have made a dent in not just the affordable housing crisis, but the displacement of so many families. And finally, too, I think we could also do some kind of targeted outreach to families that are most vulnerable, to make sure that, hey, if you're about to be evicted and you lived in a historic Black neighborhood, that you would be prioritized to get affordable housing that we built here, right? Perhaps within the same area. And then lastly, I would say, to the question of where you actually build it, you build it in areas of opportunity. And education, I think, is one key metric of opportunity. So where schools are really good and you have a campus that's doing great, maybe that's where you build the affordable housing, so those children who live in affordable housing can go to those top schools. So areas of opportunity is where you do it.
And what can we do when you think about that history? You talked about the 1928 plan. And so many people still in Austin don't know about this history of racial segregation, including sometimes some longtime residents, sometimes some new arrivals as well. Why is that history so important? And what can we do to make sure that we're not repeating that history, and that we really do? Because I think what you're saying is both the state, but also the city and all of us who are in the city, we owe a debt in terms of there has to be reparations. One, we have to acknowledge it, We have to acknowledge it, and we owe a debt. And this is, sometimes we talk about the precursors at UT and the first class of African Americans and students of color to help desegregate the 40 acres. But the wider city of Austin and Travis County, we owe a debt. And the state of Texas, I agree with you, owes a debt. Why is that history so important? Why should we have that history at the forefront when we're thinking of new plans to not even just ameliorate what's happening with gentrification, because this is continuing apace, because your study looks at 2000 to 2010. And I think once we get new census data, 2010 to 2020, there's going to be even more dispersal because we see so much wealth coming into the city. Mm-hmm. And mea culpa, you know, those of us who've moved into the city the past 5-6 years, we're part of it. We're part of it. You know, housing, we purchased houses that are $500,000, $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 moving to the city of Austin, and you're part of driving these values and property taxes higher and higher, and even the displacement vis-a-vis of some school closures. When we think about gentrification and its connection to schools being closed that serve predominantly underrepresented communities, there's links there. So why is that history so important, 1928? And you talk about Clarksville, Eric. It'd be great if you broke down, because everybody loves going to Clarksville and getting some good food and stuff, but Clarksville has this deeper history connected to the African-American community. And even like 1930, I think there was 15%, it goes down to 1% in 4 or 5 years connected to that 1928 plan.
Mm-hmm. So I'll pick up on the Clarksville by just simply directing everybody to the resident expert at UT on Clarksville, and that is our colleague Stephanie Lang, who's a staff person with the Division of Diversity and Community Engagement. She'll take you through the history and give you a tour, but in short, you know, it's one of the first Freeman communities in Austin. You know, was established while, you know, slavery was still a thing here in Texas, and free people lived there, and they created one of the first and most vibrant and lasting and enduring Black communities in Austin. And over the course of the 19th and early 20th century, many of the families were displaced owing to a number of factors, not the least of which was the way that the Mopac Expressway was just laid down right over its community. And then, of course, you know, gentrification comes on its heels. So we need to know this history because we're living in the history. We're living in this history. And I think one of the things that people don't get is, you know, when they see all this resurgent racism, when they see all this, you know, retrenchment of voting rights and the kind of, you know, revanchism that, you know, was so on display during this presidential election year. The reason we're seeing all of this is because we've never reckoned with it to begin with, right? You can't possibly have any of this go away. You can't reverse any of it unless you've reckoned with it. And I would say, you know, not to pick on Austin alone, but since this is the topic of our conversation today, that we haven't really reckoned with 1928 and the master plan in any real way here in Austin. I mean, we make more eye contact with it these days than we have in the past. In the past, I think it was complete denial. And by the past, I mean like a decade ago. At least now, more people know about it. More people know about the restricted covenants that are on houses such as the ones in your neighborhood. But just because we make eye contact with it doesn't mean that we've redressed it in any way. And so, you know, we're still at the beginning stages of a discussion on what racial reckoning and racial redress means. And one of the beginning stages involves just getting clear about what the history was.
I want to start with some questions from folks who are participating. Sure. One, what is UT's role in gentrification historically? And you know, one thing I would want you to tell people, Eric, is what's the role of I-35 in the construction of I-35, just as a sort of geographic demarcating line in terms of east side, west side? What does that mean?
Right. So UT's role, for the most part, has been one of contributing to the displacement of historic Black and Brown communities on the east side. And it contributed to it with the building of the Irwin Center, of the baseball field and other UT developments over the course of the late 20th century into the early 21st century. So there's, an ample historical record of how the university used state law to forcibly remove people from their homes on the east side. And I would say that UT's reputation on the east side has historically been a very vexed one, or had a vexed relationship with African Americans and Mexican Americans on the east side because of that. In recent years, I believe, especially through its division of diversity and community engagement, it's tried to do some repair around that. And that includes developing a community engagement center on the east side, as well as purchasing, historic, buildings on the east side that it would use then for more community engagement in the future. But its history, for the most part, has been, I would say, contributing to the displacement of African Americans and Mexican Americans on the east side. Now, there was another question about I-35. I-35, at least where it runs, downtown in Austin, central and downtown Austin, used to also be the dividing line between Black and white Austin. It runs over, or adjacent to what was once East Avenue. And East Avenue was the dividing line. East of East Avenue was the African-American community, and then, west of it was where was the rest of Austin. And there was one-way integration during Jim Crow. What that means is that whites were allowed to avail themselves of anything they wanted on the east side, but African-Americans were not allowed to move freely west of East Avenue, right? Unless they were grabbing buses to go to work as domestics for families on the west side, or working for businesses on the central or west side.
Here's a great question. Are there any examples of cities that do it right in terms of maintaining the diversity of communities of color and investing in them? How do you maintain cultural districts of cities that are valued by city leadership and affordable for longtime residents, even as they accept new investments? Is anybody—
Wow, like the utopia.
Is anybody kind of doing it right? Because
No, I hear you. I mean, I for a moment there was like, wow, I would love to go visit that place. Well, let's be honest about what's happened to most major growing cities, especially cities that attract liberals, right? College educated liberals, is that, the housing market just skyrockets. It takes off in ways that create unaffordability. And what most cities are trying to do now is mitigate some of that inequality, but economic inequality is rampant around the country, and it's particularly pronounced in major cities, and interestingly, in major cities that attract liberals. So if you look at cities like Austin, like San Francisco, Portland, there is profound inequality compared to, say, like Fort Worth. Like, that's something that we just have to own. That said, are some cities trying to do things that are interesting and sincere? I think so. I think Denver has tried to do some things. These housing funds that I'm talking about, like the linkage fee, Denver attempted it. I think in Portland, they've tried to do some things around the right of return. So if you, lived in a historically Black neighborhood and you were displaced, can the municipal government prioritize you for affordable housing when it becomes available in the neighborhood from which you were displaced? It's yet to be seen whether or not these things make a huge difference, but I think it's worth acknowledging that people are trying. And I'll leave it there. I won't say that, they're ideal, but they are attempts. And, I think we should continue to pay attention to them.
Yeah, so what can be done? This is a great question about the responsibility of whites who are interested in racial justice and who are moving into these areas. What can they do to, one, not contribute to displacement, but to push for racial equity whether it's in the schools they're in, the neighborhoods they're moving into, just their supply chains? What can they do?
That is a huge question. And, I don't know that I'm in a position at the moment to tell white people what to do about racial justice and redress beyond some of the things that I've spoken about just in general around those questions. But I do know that there are some really good white anti-racist groups here in Austin. Their names escape me at the moment, which I feel, embarrassed about because they're friends of mine. But maybe if I find them before we break, I can throw them in the chat. But there are. You're muted, Peniel. There are, white anti-racist groups in Austin working through these very questions, which are hard questions to answer because, they're conditional, they're circumstantial. And so yeah, I'll leave it there.
Here's a question that says, can you speak to subsidized housing benefits being used by non-racial minorities and therefore those benefits not really helping to increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in those areas? But maybe those are being used to help vis-a-vis anti-poverty.
I'm not knowledgeable to speak on that particular issue. I will say though that, it is common enough that people who need affordable housing the most don't always get prioritized for it. And we don't have enough controls and enough monitoring to make sure that that doesn't happen.
Here's one about the development code and how does this play into gentrification? How do we end up with the minimum lot sizes, additional dwelling units, single family zoning, deed restrictions? What reform should we be pursuing? And I would add, especially in light that we see the city council, what we've done with APD and trying to reimagine public safety, and this is all connected and linked. So what is the development code? Are there any policy solutions that we could do to increase density while not increasing poverty or increasing,
Yeah, well, I think, the development code, which was, highly contested here in Austin, to say the least, right? Believe the name of it was Code Next, right? I think
Yes.
we've since called it something else to take away some of that negative branding. To be honest, as I read through that mammoth document, I didn't see much about deep affordability.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know that I had necessarily a dog in that fight as somebody who's thinking about displacement and how displacement's happening and where it's happening. Like, it wasn't about density versus not density. It was about how do you get to the deeper affordability. And I don't think the housing code really addresses that. That said, though, I think, we could think of increasing density in certain areas with a mindset that is focused on affordability. Because, if, for instance, so many of the, poorest of the poor, the vulnerable are, single men, right, who wind up on the street, how does our code actually allow for areas of density and new construction that would accommodate, SROs for single room occupancies for these people who would otherwise be homeless? If we know that a lot of the homeless are also suffering from different health issues that require services which are located downtown, how again might our code actually more surgically, more granularly get to that? I think that is something we should have more discussions about. But some of that specificity gets lost in the debate about, square footage and number of families and density. And so I don't always know that the code discussion is the most relevant one when it comes to what we're seeing around Black displacement and displacement of the poor.
Well, here's a question about COVID-19 and housing affordability and gentrification. What about eviction laws? Like, how is Austin handling when we think about renters, people who've lost their jobs, people who are in the restaurant industry, people of color who are facing housing affordabilities before this crisis? How has Austin been, and really the state of Texas, vis-a-vis those most vulnerable populations?
You know, perhaps relative to other cities in Texas, but then again, maybe not. When we think of what Houston's done, I think Austin has tried to, you know, do what's right around evictions, as well as set aside funds for, you know, the most vulnerable families. There was the Rise Fund, which, you know, was instituted, but I also have to say that it was a political battle to get these things through. Things that, you know, in the name of racial justice and economic justice should have been just automatic. You know, activists had to fight tooth and nail to get these things funded. So, you know, I don't know that, you know, as I don't know if it's relevant for me to give them a report card, you know, but what I grade, but what I'm saying is that that yes, you know, there were things done to stem evictions and to help give some cash assistance to the most vulnerable families. But to me, it's a shame that it had to be so, you know, so doggedly fought for. I think a city like Austin, given our political sensibilities, could have done this and done more. And I'll always say that we could always do more.
All right, my last question for you. I want you to, Dr. Eric Tang, give us some marching orders. What can we do proactively, all of us who've been here, moving forward right after this webinar in terms of racial justice and gentrification? What can we do? What are some just simple steps that we can do, both leading towards this election, but after the election? Because I think some people think of the election as Armageddon, and the day after, all our problems are either going to continue or be over, but it's not that simple. So what can we do?
Yeah, you know, I'm not going to give marching orders, you know, but I may instead sound like a stuck record and repeat some of the things that I already have. And that is, you know, number one, let's begin with, you know, the COVID response, right? If we have a thing like the Rise Fund that, you know, was just straight up cash assistance to families who are most vulnerable, and we know it's worked, then all of us need to get on, you know, our city council representatives and make sure that those funds get renewed, replenished, even if the federal government makes, you know, very stringent requirements for that federal funding, right? And this is especially, you know, true for undocumented people who just can't access any of it. If we know there are industries where people are more vulnerable to getting COVID, right, but they're afraid to get tested because they might lose their jobs, then can we mobilize to make sure that they are, you know, protected? Because citizens in Austin, you know, activists in Austin are paying attention. And so we know that, you know, people are being let go because they're getting tested and doing the right thing. If we see that there are tens of thousands of people whose income in Austin doesn't allow for them to actually live in Austin, then we have to ask ourselves, well, where are they going to live? You know, and you know, and if it means they can't live here, then don't we all need to join together and support city leaders who are thinking seriously about building affordable housing? Listen, none of this is going away unless we actually build affordable housing. That is the first step. And we could talk all day about the reasons why, and we could talk all day about the market, but this inequality and these displacements won't go away unless real dollars are invested in building physical affordable housing within the city limits.
All right, we'll close there. I mean, I'm still hopeful and optimistic that this year is going to lead to a lot more justice and a lot more equity. Thank you so much. Dr. Eric Tang has been talking with us and just breaking it down and schooling us all on racial justice and the pursuit of racial justice and gentrification. I want to thank Emily Dunkley, our program administrator, who makes all this happen in terms of at the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. Thank those who are on our advisory board, those who attend all of our events, our graduate students, our undergraduate students, our CSRD fellows, and really the faculty and staff and students and organizers at the University of Texas at Austin. You might have seen some of them, including some of our students. Renee Otero just had a New York Times op-ed piece, and you know, UT has been sort of in the news, but we really do have a community here that has a long track record of trying to build social justice that's anti-racist, that is interested in building that beloved community that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. talked about. the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. You can check us out online. You can see what we're doing. Support us, please, if you want, if you can. And, you know, we will be back very, very soon to try to produce more justice. So, you know, thank you, everybody who was on this webinar. And we hope to see you again very, very soon. Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.